The morning sun had barely crested over the rolling hills of Millbrook County when I heard the familiar rumble of my old John Deere tractor coming to life. Another day, another dollar, as my grandfather used to say before he passed this 100-acre farm down to me. I had no idea that this particular Tuesday would become the most bizarre and life-changing day of my 34 years on this earth. I was Marcus Thompson, a third-generation farmer who believed in keeping to himself and letting others do the same. My property sat at the end of Willow Creek Road, bordered by dense woods on 3 sides and a quiet country lane on the 4th. It was peaceful, isolated, and exactly how I liked it. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Patricia Kellerman, though everyone in town knew her by a different name entirely, Karen. That's what the folks at Millbrook General Store called her, though never to her face. Patricia Kellerman was a 62-year-old, retired bank manager who had moved to our sleepy farming community 3 years prior, seeking what she called rural tranquility. What she found instead was a burning desire to regulate, control, and complain about every aspect of country life that didn't align with her suburban sensibilities. Our first encounter had been over my rooster, Hercules, whose morning announcements apparently violated her idea of a peaceful dawn. Then came complaints about my tractor's excessive noise during harvest season, followed by accusations that my irrigation system was somehow affecting her well water. Each grievance was meticulously documented and reported to various county officials, none of whom took her concerns seriously. This was farm country, after all, and farming made noise, smells, and required heavy machinery. But Patricia, Karen, was nothing if not persistent. The trouble began in earnest 3 weeks before the fence incident. I'd decided to expand my vegetable operation, converting a 5-acre section of unused pasture into rows of tomatoes, peppers, and summer squash. The land was entirely within my property boundaries, a fact I'd verified twice with the county surveyor after Karen's previous boundary disputes. The new garden sat roughly 200 yards from her pristine colonial-style home, visible from her kitchen window but hardly an intrusion. Apparently, Karen disagreed. The first sign of her displeasure came in the form of a certified letter delivered by our bewildered mail carrier, Pete Hawkins, who'd been serving rural routes for 23 years and had never seen anything like it. The letter, typed in formal business language that would have made a lawyer proud, demanded that I cease all agricultural activities within 500 yards of her property line, citing noise pollution, dust concerns, and something called visual blight. I'd laughed out loud reading it, then called my attorney Jim Morrison, not the famous one, but a local man who'd helped my family with land issues for decades. Jim's response was succinct. "She has no legal standing whatsoever. You're farming. Your own land. Frame the letter and use it for kindling." But Karen wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Over the following weeks, she launched what could only be described as a campaign of bureaucratic warfare. Phone calls to the county commissioner's office about improper agricultural zoning. Complaints to the state environmental agency about potential groundwater contamination from my organic fertilizer. Reports to the health department about unsanitary conditions created by my compost bins. Each agency would dutifully send an inspector who would arrive, look around with barely concealed amusement, and file a report stating that everything was perfectly normal and legal. The irony wasn't lost on me that Karen had moved to farm country and was now trying to eliminate farming. Things escalated dramatically when she installed security cameras along her property line, all pointed directly at my fields. When I discovered them during my morning rounds mounted on tall poles like some kind of agricultural surveillance state, I felt my usually calm demeanor crack for the first time. I marched over to her house, still wearing my work boots caked with honest dirt, and knocked firmly on her front door. She answered wearing a crisp white blouse and perfectly pressed khakis, looking like she was headed to a country club board meeting rather than living on a rural road surrounded by working farms. "Mrs. Kellerman," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "we need to talk about those cameras." Her response was delivered with the kind of cold precision that I imagined had terrified bank customers for decades. "Mr. Thompson, I have every right to install security equipment on my own property. Perhaps if you conducted your activities With more consideration for your neighbors, such measures wouldn't be necessary. Those cameras are pointed at my fields, my livestock, and my home, I replied. That's not security, that's harassment. She smiled then, a thin, satisfied expression that chilled me more than her words. I'm simply documenting the ongoing disruption to my peaceful enjoyment of my property. Should legal action become necessary, I want to ensure I have adequate evidence. That's when I knew this wasn't just about noise or dust or rooster calls. Karen had declared war on my way of life, and she intended to win. The morning of the fence incident started like any other. I was up before dawn, as farmers always are, checking on my small herd of Black Angus cattle in the east pasture. The fence line there had always been solid, oak posts set in concrete with 3 layers of high-tensile wire that could stop a charging bull. It separated my grazing land from the narrow gravel road that led to Karen's driveway. As I worked, I noticed Karen's silver Lexus sedan parked at an odd angle near her mailbox, positioned so she had a clear view of my morning routine. She sat behind the wheel like some kind of surveillance operative, occasionally raising what looked like binoculars to her eyes. The sight was so absurd I almost laughed. Almost. By 8 o'clock, I was back at the house enjoying a well-deserved cup of coffee and planning my day when I heard the first siren. Then another. Then the unmistakable rumble of heavy vehicles turning onto our usually quiet road. I stepped onto my front porch to see a parade of official vehicles making their way toward my farm. 2 county sheriff's deputies, an animal control truck, a vehicle from the state agricultural department, and bringing up the rear, a fire department ambulance. All of this activity was being carefully observed by Karen, who had emerged from her car and was now standing beside her mailbox with what appeared to be a clipboard. Sheriff's Deputy Mike Rodriguez was the first to reach me. I'd known Mike since high school, where he'd been 2 years behind me and captain of the wrestling team. His expression as he approached was a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. "Morning, Marcus," he said, removing his hat. "I'm real sorry about this, but we've received some serious complaints about your operation here." "What kind of complaints?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea of their source. Mike consulted his notes with obvious reluctance. Allegations of animal cruelty, improper waste disposal, operating without required permits, and... He paused, clearly struggling with the absurdity of what he was about to say. "Maintaining a public nuisance that poses a health risk to neighboring properties." I stared at him in disbelief. "Mike, you've known me and my family for 20 years. Have you ever seen any sign of animal cruelty or health violations on this property?" "Course not," he replied quickly. "But when complaints are made, we have to investigate. You know how it works." Over the next 2 hours, I watched as various officials tramped through my fields, barns, and outbuildings, dutifully documenting the complete normalcy of everything they found. My cattle were healthy and properly cared for. My waste management systems exceeded county requirements. Every permit and license was current and properly displayed. The only thing they couldn't document was my growing frustration and anger. Karen, meanwhile, had stationed herself at the property line like a general observing a battle, occasionally pointing out areas she thought deserved special attention. I could see her speaking animatedly to each official, no doubt providing her own interpretation of standard farming practices. The breaking point came when the animal control officer, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who clearly knew nothing about livestock, suggested that my cattle appeared agitated and might need to be evaluated for stress-related behavioral issues. This was after Bessie, my gentlest cow, had approached the fence looking for the handful of grain I usually carried in my pocket. "That's it," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is harassment, pure and simple, and I won't stand for it anymore." I marched over to where Karen stood with her clipboard, my patience finally exhausted. "Mrs. Kellerman, this has gone far enough. These people have real jobs to do, real emergencies to handle, and you're wasting their time with made-up complaints about a perfectly legal farming operation." Her response was delivered with the same cold smile I'd seen before, but this time there was something else in her eyes, a kind of manic satisfaction that made me take a step back. "Mr. Thompson," she said loudly enough for all the officials to hear, Your aggressive behavior right now is exactly why I've been forced to document these ongoing issues. Perhaps these officers should also be aware of your history of threatening behavior toward me. The lie was so brazen, so completely fabricated, that for a moment I couldn't speak. Mike Rodriguez looked uncomfortable, caught between his knowledge. The call came at 11:47 a.m., just as I was finishing lunch and preparing to head back out to check on my irrigation system. The voice on the other end was frantic, barely recognizable as my neighbor Tom Bradley, whose farm bordered mine on the eastern side. "Marcus! Marcus, you need to get over here right now. There's been an accident, a bad one." I could hear sirens wailing in the background, multiple vehicles by the sound of it. My blood ran cold as I thought about Sheriff Morrison's warning from just hours earlier. "What kind of accident, Tom? Is someone hurt?" "It's that woman, your neighbor, the one who's been causing all the trouble. Jesus, Marcus, she drove her car straight through your fence and into Miller's Creek. The car's upside down in the water, and they're trying to get her out now." I was already grabbing my keys and running for my truck before he finished speaking. The quarter-mile drive to the crash site felt like it took forever, even though I probably covered it in under 2 minutes. What I found when I arrived was a scene of controlled chaos that would be burned into my memory forever. Karen's silver Lexus was indeed upside down in Miller's Creek, the same shallow waterway that had provided irrigation for 3 generations of my family's crops. The car had punched through nearly 50 feet of my fence line, leaving a trail of destruction that included 2 oak fence posts snapped clean in half and enough twisted wire to stock a hardware store. Emergency responders were everywhere. Fire. Department rescue divers were in the creek, working to extract Karen from the submerged vehicle, while paramedics stood ready with equipment I couldn't identify, but that looked ominously serious. Sheriff's deputies were directing traffic and setting up a perimeter, their faces grim with the kind of professional focus that comes with life-or-death situations. But it was the skid marks that told the real story. They started nearly a quarter mile. Back on the main road, dark rubber streaks that spoke of someone driving far too fast for the narrow country lane. The marks showed a vehicle accelerating rather than braking, picking up speed as it approached the sharp curve where Willow Creek Road met the straightaway past my property. Instead of following the curve, the skid marks went straight, directly, toward my fence line and the creek beyond. This wasn't an accident. This was someone driving with deadly intent. Sheriff Morrison appeared at my elbow as I stared at the destruction. His expression was a mixture of anger and something that might have been fear. "Marcus, I need you to think very carefully about what I'm going to ask you," he said quietly. "Did you have any contact with Mrs. Kellerman after you left the station? This morning?" "None at all," I replied. "I came straight home and stayed on my property. Haven't seen or heard from her since yesterday." He nodded, making notes in his ever-present notebook. "What about phone calls? Text messages? Any form of communication?" "Nothing. My phone's been with me all morning. You can check the records, if you need to." Before he could respond, there was a commotion at the creek. The rescue divers had managed to extract Karen from the vehicle, and she was being loaded onto a backboard for transport to the ambulance. Even from 50 yards away, I could see she was conscious and appeared to be arguing with the paramedics. "She's going to be okay," Sheriff Morrison said, following my gaze. "Banged up pretty good, but the water probably saved her life. If she'd hit those oak posts head-on instead of going through them into the creek, we'd be looking at a very different situation." As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, I found myself staring at the wreckage of my fence and trying to process what had just happened. The woman who had spent months trying to shut down my farm had just destroyed a significant portion of my property in what appeared to be a suicide attempt or an incredibly reckless act of revenge. "Sheriff," I said slowly, "what exactly did she tell you when you pulled her out?" Morrison's expression darkened. "That's what worries me, Marcus. She wasn't making much sense, but she kept saying something about showing you and making you pay. The paramedics think she might have a concussion, but you don't think that's what's causing her to talk like that?" "No, I don't. I think Patricia Kellerman has been planning something like this for a while now, and I think you were supposed to be involved somehow." The implications of that statement hit me like a physical blow. "You mean she was trying to hit me with her car?" I mean, I think she was trying to create a situation where you'd be blamed for whatever happened to her. Look at the evidence, Marcus. She calls in a false report about you in the middle of the night, establishes a pattern of you supposedly threatening her, then has a convenient accident on your property that damages your fence and nearly kills her. If she died in that creek, who do you think would have been the prime suspect? I stared at him in horror as the full scope of Karen's plan became clear. She hadn't just been trying to shut down my farm. She'd been trying to frame me for her murder. The problem, Sheriff Morrison continued, is that she survived, and now we need to figure out what her next move is going to be. Over the next several hours, as I arranged for emergency fence repairs and dealt with insurance investigators, I learned more about Karen's activities in the days leading up to the crash. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had been methodically preparing for some kind of final confrontation. According to her bank records, which Sheriff Morrison was able to access as part of the investigation, Karen had withdrawn $15,000 in cash 3 days earlier. Her internet search history, obtained through a warrant, showed extensive research into property law, personal injury lawsuits, and, most disturbingly, articles about how to make accidents look deliberate and how to create evidence of stalking and harassment. But the most chilling discovery came from her own security cameras, the ones she'd installed to monitor my property. The footage from the morning of the crash showed Karen in her driveway at 6:30 a.m., pacing back and forth while talking animatedly on her phone. At one point, she gestured violently toward my farm, clearly agitated about something. The audio was too distant to make out words, but the body language was unmistakable. This was someone working themselves up to take drastic action. The question, Sheriff Morrison said, as we reviewed the footage in his office later that afternoon, is what triggered her to act today specifically. Something set her off, and I need to know what it was. The answer came from an unexpected source. My attorney, Jim Morrison. Marcus, he said when he called me that evening, I think I know what pushed her over the edge. I got a call from her attorney this morning. Apparently, she'd been trying to hire him to file a massive lawsuit against you for harassment, property damage, and emotional distress. When he told her she had no legal basis for any of those claims, she became abusive and threatened to sue him too. So she realized her legal options were exhausted? More than that. Her attorney said she made some very specific threats about taking matters into her own hands. He was actually planning to call the sheriff's office to report her behavior when news of the crash came in. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more disturbing than I'd imagined. Karen hadn't just snapped under pressure. She'd been planning what appeared to be an elaborate scheme to destroy my life, possibly including my death, and when her legal maneuvering failed, she'd moved to what she saw as the final option. But fate, in the form of physics and a creek that was deeper than she'd anticipated, had other plans. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to my farm. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne was a forensic psychiatrist from the state hospital, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the sort of calm demeanor that probably came from years of dealing with people in crisis. Mr. Thompson, she said as we sat on my front porch, I've been asked to evaluate Mrs. Kellerman's mental state, and I was hoping you could help me understand the history of your interactions with her. I spent the next hour recounting the entire saga, from the first complaint about my rooster to the crash that had brought us to this point. Dr. Hawthorne took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific incidents or Karens. Exact words during our confrontations. What you're describing, she said when I finished, fits a pattern I've seen before. It's called delusional disorder, and it can be extremely dangerous when the delusions involve persecution and revenge. You're saying she's mentally ill? I'm saying she's developed a fixed false belief system centered around you as a threat to her well-being. In her mind, everything you do, every normal farming activity, every legal response to her complaints, confirms her belief that you're trying to harm her. It creates a feedback loop where her actions become increasingly extreme because she genuinely believes she's defending herself. Dr. Hawthorne explained that people with this condition often appear completely normal in other aspects of their lives. They can hold jobs, maintain other relationships, and function in society. But when it comes to the focus of their delusion, they become capable of almost anything. The crash wasn't an accident, was it? I asked. Based on my preliminary evaluation, I believe Mrs. Kellerman was attempting what we call a staged incident. She intended to create a situation where you would be blamed for her death or serious injury, which would serve both as revenge against you and validation of her belief that you were dangerous, the though.